Chapter 12, Conclusion. Repent ye, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. I was finishing this book, which I had been working on for 2 years, when I happened on the 9th of September to be traveling by rail through the governments of Tula and Rizan, where the peasants were starving last year and where the famine is even more severe now. At one of the railroad stations, my train passed an extra train, which was taking a troop of soldiers under the conduct of the governor of the province, together with muskets, cartridges, and rods, to flog and murder those same famishing peasants. The punishment of flogging, by way of carrying the decree of the authorities into effect, has been more and more frequently adopted of late in Russia, in spite of the fact that corporal punishment was abolished by law 30 years ago. I had heard of this. I'd even read in the newspapers of the fearful flogging which had been inflicted in Chernihiv, Tambov, Saratov, Astrakhan, and Oral, and of those which the governor of Nizhny Novgorod, General Baranov, had boasted, but I had never before happened to see men in the process of carrying out these punishments. And here I saw the spectacle of good Russians full of the Christian spirit traveling with guns and rods to torture and kill their starving brethren. The reason for their expedition was as follows. On one of the estates of a rich landowner, the peasants had common rights to the forest, and having always enjoyed these rights, regarded the forest as their own, or at least as theirs in common with the owner. The landowner wished to keep the forest entirely to himself and began to fell the trees. The peasants lodged a complaint. The judges in the first instant gave an unjust decision. I say unjust on the authority of the lawyer and governor, who ought to understand the matter, and decided the case in the favor of the landowner. All the later decisions, even that of the Senate, though they could see that the matter had been unjustly decided, confirmed the judgment and adjusted the forest to the landowner. He began to cut down the trees, but the peasants, unable to believe that such obvious injustice could be done them by higher authorities, did not submit to the decision, and drove away the men sent down to cut the trees, declaring that the forest belonged to them and they would go to the Tsar before they would let it be cut down. The matter was referred to Petersburg, and the order was transmitted to the governor to carry the decision on the court into effect. The governor asked for a troop of soldiers, and here were the soldiers with bayonets and cartridges and moreover a supply of rods, expressly prepared for the purpose and heaped up in one of the trucks, going to carry the decision of the higher authorities into effect. The decisions of the higher authorities are carried into effect by means of murder or torture, or threats of one or the other, according to whether they offer resistance or not. In the first case, if the peasants offer resistance, the practice is in Russia, and is the same everywhere where a state organization and private property exist as follows. The governor delivers an address in which he demands submission. The excited crowd, generally deluded by their leaders, don't understand a word of what the representatives of authority are saying in the pompous official language, and their excitement continues. Then the governor announces that if they do not submit and disperse, he will be obliged to have recourse to force. If the crowd does not disperse even on this, the governor gives the order to fire over the heads of the crowd. If the crowd does not even then disperse, the governor gives the order to fire straight into the crowd. The soldiers fire, and the killed and wounded fall about the street. Then the crowd usually runs away in all directions, and the troops at the governor's command take those who are supposed to be the ringleaders and lead them off under escort. Then they pick up the dying, the wounded and dead, covered with blood, sometimes women and children among them. The dead they bury, and the wounded they carry to the hospital. Those whom they regard as the ringleaders they take to the town hall and have them tried by a special court-martial. And then they have had recourse to violence on their side. They are condemned to be hanged. And then the gallows is erected, and then they solemnly strangle a few defenseless creatures. This is what has been done in Russia, and is and must always be done where the social order is based on force. But in the second case, when the peasants do submit, something quite special, peculiar to Russia, takes place. The governor arrives on the scene of action and delivers a harangue to the people, reproaching them for their insubordination, and either stations troops in the house of the villages, where sometimes for a whole month the soldiers drain the resources of the peasants, or contenting himself with threats, he mercifully takes leave of the people, or what is the most frequent course, he announces that the ringleaders must be punished, and quite arbitrarily, without any trial, selects a certain number of men, regarded as ringleaders, and commands them to be flogged in his presence. In order to give an idea of how such things are done, I will describe a proceeding of a kind which took place in Oral, and received the full approval of the highest authorities. This is what took place in Oral. Just as here in the Tula province, a landlord wanted to appropriate the property, and the peasants, and just in the same way the peasants opposed it. The matter in dispute was a fall of water, which irrigated the peasant's field, and which a landowner wanted to cut off and divert to turn his mill. The peasants rebelled against this being done. The landowner laid a complaint before the district commander, who illegally, as was recognized later even by a legal decision, decided the matter in favor of the landowner and allowed him to divert the watercourse. The landowner sent workmen to dig the conduit by which the water was to be let off to turn the mill. The peasants were indignant at this unjust decision and sent their women to prevent the landowner's men from digging his conduit. The women went to the dikes, overturned the carts, and drove away the men. The landowner made a complaint against the woman for thus taking the law into their own hands. The district commander made an order that from every house throughout the village, one woman was to be taken and put in prison. The order was not easily executed, for in every household there were several women, and it was impossible to know which one was to be arrested. Consequently, the police did not carry out the order. The landowner complained to the governor on the neglect of the part of the police, and the latter, without examining into the affair, gave the chief official of the police strict orders to carry out the instructions of the district commander without delay. The police official, in obedience to superior, went to the village and, with the insolence peculiar to Russian officials, ordered his policemen to take one woman out of each house. But since there were more than one woman in each house, and there was no knowing which one was sentenced to imprisonment, disputes and opposition arose. In spite of these disputes and opposition, however, the office of police gave orders that some woman, whichever came first, should be taken out from each household and led away to prison. The peasants began to defend their wives, and mothers would not let them go, and beat the police and their officer. This was a fresh and terrible crime. Resistance was offered to the authorities. A report of this new offense was sent to the town. And so this governor, precisely as the governor of Tula was doing on that day, with a battalion of soldiers with guns and rods, hastily brought together by means of telegraphs, telephones, and railways, proceeded by a special train to the scene of action, with a learned doctor whose duty it was to ensure the flogging being of a hygienic character. Herzen's prophecy of the modern Genghis Khan with his telegrams is completely realized by this governor. Before the town hall of the district were a soldiery, a battalion of police with their revolvers slung around them with red cords, the persons of most importance among the peasants and the culprits. A crowd of 1,000 or more people were standing around. The governor, on arriving, stepped out of his carriage, delivered a prepared harangue, and asked for the culprits on a bench. The latter demand was at first not understood, but a police constable whom the governor always took about with him, and who undertook to organize such executions, by no means exceptional in that province, explained that what was meant for a bench was a flogging. A bench was brought as well as the rods, and then the executioner was summoned. The latter had been selected beforehand from some horse-stealers of the same village, as a soldier refused the office. When everything was ready, the governor ordered the first of the 12 culprits pointed out by the landowner as the most guilty to come forward. The first to come forward was the head of a family, a man of 40 who had always stood up manfully for the rights of his class, and therefore was held in the greatest esteem by all the villagers. He was led to the bench and stripped, and then ordered to lie down. The peasants attempted to supplicate by mercy, but seeing it was useless, he crossed himself and lay down. 2 police constables hastened to hold him up. The learned doctor stood by, in readiness to give his aid in his medical science when they should be needed. The convicts spit into their hands, brandished the rods, and began to flog. It seemed, however, that the bench was too narrow, and it was difficult to keep the victim writhing in torture upon it. Then the governor ordered them to bring another bench and to put a plank across it. Soldiers with their hands raised in their caps and respectful murmurs of, "Yes, Your Excellency," hastened obediently to carry out his order. Meanwhile the tortured man, half naked, pale and scowling, stood waiting, his eyes fixed on the ground and his teeth chattering. When another bench had been brought, they again made him lie down, and the convicted thieves again began to flog him. The victim's back, thighs, and legs, even his sides, became more and more covered with scars and wheals, and every blow there came the sound of deep groans which he could no longer restrain. In the crowd standing round were heard the sobs of wives, mothers, children, the families of the tortured man, and of all the others picked out for punishment. The miserable governor, intoxicated with power, was counting the strokes on his finger, and never left off smoking cigarettes, while several officious persons hastened on every opportunity to offer him a burning match to light them. When more than 50 strokes had been given, the peasants ceased to shriek and writhe, and the doctor, who had been educated in governmental institution to serve his sovereign and his country with his scientific attainment, went up to the victim, felt his pulse, listened to his heart, and announced to the representative authority that the man undergoing punishment had lost consciousness, and that, in accordance with the conclusion of science, to continue the punishment would endanger the victim's life. But the miserable governor, now completely intoxicated by the sight of blood, gave orders that the punishment should go on, and the flogging was continued up to 70 strokes, the number which the governor had for some reason fixed upon as necessary. When the 70th stroke had been reached, the governor said, "Enough, next one." And the mutilated victim, his back covered with blood, was lifted up and carried away unconscious, and another was led up. The sobs and groans of the crowd grew louder, but the representative of the state continued the torture. Thus they flogged each of them up to the 12th, and each of them received 70 strokes. They all implored mercy, shrieked, and groaned. The sobs and cries of the crowd of women grew louder and more heart-rending, and the men's faces grew darker and darker. But they were surrounded by troops, and the torture did not cease till it had reached the limit where it had been fixed by the caprice of the miserable, half-drunken, and insane creature they call a governor. The officials and officers and soldiers not only assisted in it, but were even partly responsible for the affair, since by their presence they prevented any integration on the part of the crowd. When I inquired of one of the governors why they made use of this kind of torture when people had already submitted and soldiers were stationed in the village, he replied with the important air of a man who thoroughly understands all the subtleties of statecraft, that if the peasants were not thoroughly subdued by flogging, they would begin offering opposition to the decisions of authorities again. When some of them had been thoroughly tortured, the authority of the state would be secured forever among them. And so that was why the governor of Tula was going on in his turn with his subordinate officials, officers and soldiers, to carry out a similar measure. By precisely the same means, that is, by murder and torture, obedience to the decision of the higher authorities was to be secured. And this decision was to enable a young landowner who had an income of 100,000 to gain 3,000 rubles more by stealing a forest from a whole community of cold and famished peasants, to spend it in 2 or 3 weeks in the salons of Moscow, Petersburg, or Paris. That was what those people whom I met were going to do. After my thoughts had for 2 years been turned to the same direction, fate seemed expressly to have brought me face to face for the first time in my life with a fact which showed me absolutely, unmistakably in practice what had long been clear to me in theory, that the organization of your society rests, not as people interested in maintaining the present order of things like to imagine, on certain principles or jurisprudence, but on simple brute force, on the murder and torture of men. People who own great estates or fortunes, or who receive great revenues drawn from the class who are in even want of necessities, the working class, as well as those who, like merchants, doctors, artists, clerks, learned professors, coachmen, cooks, writers, valets, barristers, make their living about these rich people, like to believe that the privileges they enjoy are not the result of force, but of absolutely free and just interchange of services, and that their advantages, far from being gained from such punishment and murders as took place in Orel and several parts of Russia this year, and are always taking place all over Europe and America, have no kind of connection with these acts of violence. They like to believe that their privileges exist apart and are the result of free contract among people, and that the violent cruelties perpetrated on these people also exist apart and are the result of some general judicial, political, or economical laws. They try not to see what they all enjoy their privileges as a result of the same fact which forces the peasants who have tended the forest, and who are in direct need of it for fuel, to give it up to a rich landowner who has taken no part in caring for its growth, and has no need of it whatever. The fact it is that if they don't give it up, they will be flogged or killed. And yet it is clear that it was only by means of menaces, blows, or murder that the mill in Orel was enabled to yield a larger income, or that the forest which the peasants had planted became the property of the landowner. It should be equally clear that all the other exclusive rights enjoyed by the rich, by robbing the poor of their necessities, rest on the same basis of violence. If the peasants, who need land to maintain their families, may not cultivate the land about their houses, but one man, a Russian, English, Austrian, or any other great landowner, possesses land enough to maintain 1,000 families, though that does not cultivate it himself, and if a merchant, profiting by the misery of the cultivators, taking corn from them at 1/3 of its value, can keep this corn in his granaries with perfect security while men are starving all around him, and sell it again for 3 times its value to the very cultivators he bought it from, it is evident that all this too comes from the same cause. And if one man may not buy of another a commodity from the other side of a certain fixed line, called the frontier, without paying certain duties on it to men who have taken no part whatever in its production, and if men are driven to sell their last cow to pay taxes, which the government distributes among its functionaries, and spends on maintaining soldiers to murder these very taxpayers, it would appear self-evident that all this does not come about as a result of any abstract law, but is based on just what is done in oral and what may be done in Tula, and is done periodically in one form or another throughout the whole world, wherever there is a government and where there are rich and poor. Simply because torture and murder are not employed in every instance of oppression by force, those who enjoy the exclusive privileges of the ruling classes persuade themselves and others that their privileges are not based on torture and murder, but on some mysterious general cause, abstract laws, and so on. Yet one would think it was perfectly clear that if men, who consider it unjust, and all the working classes do consider it so nowadays, still pay the principal part of the produce of their labor away to the capitalist and the landowner, and pay taxes, though they know to what bad use these taxes are put, they do so not from recognition of abstract laws of which they have never heard, but only because they know they will be beaten and killed if they don't do so. And if there is no need to imprison, beat, kill men every time the landlord collects his rents, every time those who in want of bread have to pay a swindling merchant 3 times its value, every time the factory hand has to be content with a wage less than half of the profit made by his employer, and every time a poor man pays his last ruble in taxes, it is because so many men have been beaten and killed for trying to resist his demands, that the lesson has now been learned very thoroughly. Just as a trained tiger, who does not eat meat put under his nose, and jumps over a stick at the word of a command, does not act thus because he likes it, but because he remembers the red-hot irons or the fast to which he was punished every time he did not obey. So men submitting to what is disadvantageous or even ruinous to them, and considered by them as unjust, act thus because they remember what the suffering for resisted it. As for those who profit by the privilege gained by previous acts of violence, they often forget and like to forget how these privileges were obtained. But one need only recall the facts of history, not the history of the exploits of different dynasties of rulers, but real history, the history of the oppression of the majority by a small number of men, to see that all the advantages the rich have over the poor are based on nothing but flogging, imprisonment, and murder. One need but reflect on the unceasing, persistent struggle of all to better their material position, which is the guiding motive of men of the present day, to be convinced that the advantages of the rich over the poor could never and can never be maintained by anything but force. They may be cases of oppression, of violence and punishment, though they are rare, the aim of which is not to secure the privilege of the proprietary class. But one may confidently assert that in any society where, for every man living in ease, there are 10 exhausted by labor, envious, covetous, and often suffering with their families from direct privation, all the privileges of the rich, all their luxuries and superficialities, are obtained and maintained only by torture, imprisonment, and murder. The train I met on the 9th of September, going with soldiers, guns, cartridges, and rods, to confirm the rich landowner in the possession of a small forest, which he had taken from the starving peasants, which they were in the direst need, and he was in no need of it at all, was a striking proof of how men are capable of doing deeds directly opposed to their principles, and their conscience without perceiving it. The special train consisted of one first-class carriage for the governor, the officials and officers, and several luggage vans crammed full of soldiers. The latter, smart young fellows in their clean new uniforms, were standing about in groups and sitting swinging their legs in a wide-open doorway of the luggage vans. Some were smoking, nudging each other, joking, grinning, and laughing. Others were munching sunflower seeds and spitting out the husks with an air of dignity. Some of them ran along the platform to drink some water from a tub there, and when they met the officers they slackened their pace, making their stupid gesture of salutation, raising their hands to their heads with serious faces, as though they were doing something of the greatest importance. They kept their eyes on them till they had passed by them, and then set off running still more merrily, stamping their heels on the platform, laughing and chattering after the manner of healthy, good-natured young fellows traveling in lively company. They were going to assist at the murder of their fathers or grandfathers, just as they were going to a party or pleasure, or at any rate of some quiet, ordinary business. The same impression was produced by the well-dressed functionaries and officers who were scattered about the platform and in the first-class carriage. At a table covered with bottles was sitting the governor, who was responsible for the whole expedition, dressed in his half-military uniform and eating something while he chatted tranquilly about the weather and some acquaintance he had met, as though the business he was upon was so simple and ordinary a character that it could not disturb his serenity and his interest in the change of weather. At a little distance from the table sat the general of the police. He was not taking any refreshment, and had an impenetrable bored expression, as though he were weary of the formalities to be gone through. On all sides, officers were bustling noisily about in their red uniforms trimmed with gold. One sat at a table, finishing his bottle of beer. Another stood at the buffet, eating a cake, and brushing the crumbs off his uniform. Threw down his money with a self-confident air. Another was sauntering before the carriages of our train, staring at the faces of the women. All of these men who are going to murder or to torture the famishing and defenseless creatures who provide them their sustenance had the air of men who knew very well that they were doing their duty, and some were even proud, were glorying in what they were doing. What is the meaning of it? All these people are within half an hour of reaching a place where, in order to provide a wealthy young man with 3,000 rubles stolen from a whole community of famishing peasants, they may be forced to commit the most horrible acts one can conceive. To murder or torture, as was done in Oral, innocent beings, their brothers, and they see the place and time approaching with untroubled serenity. To say that all these government officials, officers, and soldiers do not know what is before them is impossible, for they are prepared for it. The governor must have given directions about the rods. The officials must have sent an order for them, purchased them, and entered the item in their accounts. The military officers had given and received orders about cartridges. They all know that they are going to torture, perhaps kill, their famishing fellow creatures, and that they must set to work within an hour. To say, as is usually said, as they would themselves repeat, that they are acting from conviction of the necessity for supporting the state organization would be a mistake. For in the first place, these men have probably never even thought about state organization and necessity of it. In the second place, they cannot possibly be convinced that the act in which they are taking part will tend to support rather than ruin the state. And thirdly, in reality the majority, if not all of these men, far from ever sacrificing their own pleasure or tranquility to support the state, never let slip an opportunity of profiting at the expense of the state in every way they can increase their own pleasure and ease, so that they are not acting thus for the sake of the abstract principle of the state. So what is the meaning of it? Yet I know all these men. If I don't know all of them personally, I know their characters pretty nearly, their past and their way of thinking. They certainly all have mothers, some of them wives and children. They are certainly for the most part good, kind, even tender-hearted fellows, who ate every sort of cruelty, not to speak of murder. Many of them would not kill or hurt an animal. Moreover, they are all professed Christians and regard all violence directed against the defenseless as base and disgraceful. Certainly not one of them would be capable in everyday life for his own personal profit, or doing 100th part of what the governor of Oral did. Every one of them would be insulted at the supposition that he was capable of doing anything of the kind in private life. And yet they are within half an hour of reaching the place where they may be reduced to the inevitable necessity of committing this crime. What is the meaning of it? But it is not only these men who are going by train prepared for murder and torture. How could the men who began the whole business, the landowner, the commissioner, the judges, and those who gave the order and are responsible for it, the ministers, the czar, who are also good men, professed Christians, how could they elaborate such a plan and assent to it, knowing its consequence? The spectators even, who took no part in the affair, how could they, who are indignant at the sight of any cruelty in private life, even the overtaxing of a horse, allow such a horrible deed to be perpetuated? How was it that they did not raise an indignation and bar the road, shouting, "No, flog and kill starving men because they won't let their last possession be stolen from them without resistance? That we won't allow." But far from anyone doing this, the majority, even of those who were the cause of the affair, such as the commissioner, the landowner, the judge, and those who took part in it and arranged it as the governor, the minister, and the czar, are perfectly tranquil and do not even feel a prick of conscience. And apparently all the men who are going to carry out the crime are equally undisturbed. The spectators, who one would suppose could have no personal interest in the affair, looked rather with sympathy than with disapproval at all these people preparing to carry out the infamous action. In the same compartment with me was a wood merchant who had risen from a peasant. He openly expressed aloud his sympathy with such punishment. "They can't disobey the authorities," he said. "That's what the authorities are for. Let them have a lesson. Send their fleas flying. They'll give their making commotions. I warrant you, that's what they want." What is the meaning of it? It is not possible to say that all these people who have provoked or aided or allowed this deed of such worthless creatures that, knowing all the infamy of what they are doing, they do it against their principles, some for pay and for profit, others through fear of punishment. All of them in certain circumstances know how to stand up for their principles. Not one of these officials would steal a purse, read another man's letter, or put up with an affront without demanding satisfaction. Not one of these officers would consent to cheat at cards, would refuse to pay a debt of honor, would betray a comrade, run away on a field of battle, or desert the flag. Not one of these soldiers would spit out the Holy Sacrament or eat meat on Good Friday. All these men are ready to face any kind of privation, suffering, or danger, rather than consent to do what they regard as wrong. They have therefore the strength to resist doing what is against their principle. It is even less possible to assert that all these men are such brutes that it is natural and not distasteful to them to do such deeds. One need only talk to these people a little to see that all of them, the landowner even, and the judge, and the minister and the czar of the government, the officers and the soldiers, not only disapprove of such things in the depth of their soul, but suffer from the consciousness of their participation in them when they recollect what they imply. But they try not to think about it. One need only talk to any of these who are taking part in the affair, from the landowner to the lowest policeman or soldier, to see that in the depth of their soul they all know it is a wicked thing, but that it would be better to have nothing to do with it, and are suffering from the knowledge. A lady of liberal views, who was traveling in the same train with us, seeing the governor and the officers in the first-class saloon, and learning the object of their expedition, began intentionally raising her voice so that they could hear, to abuse the existing order of things, and to cry shame on men who would take part in such proceeding. Everyone felt awkward, none knew where to look, but no one contradicted her. They tried to look as though such a remark were not worth answering, but one could see by their faces and their averted eyes that they were ashamed. I noticed the same thing in the soldiers. They too knew what they were sent to do was a shameful thing, but they did not want to think about what was before them. When the wood merchant, as I suspected, insincerely only to show that he was a man of education, began to speak of the necessity of such measures, the soldiers who heard him all turned away from him, scowling and pretending not to hear. All the men who, like the landowner, the commissioner, the minister, and the czar, were responsible for the perpetration of this act, as well as those who were now going to execute it, and even those who were mere spectators of it, knew that it was a wickedness, and were ashamed of taking any share of it, and even of being present at it. Then why did they do it, or allow it to be done? Ask them the question. Ask the landowner who started the affair, and the judge who pronounced the clearly unjust, even though formally legal decision, and those who commanded the execution of the decision, and those who, like the policemen, soldiers, and peasants, will execute the deed with their own hands, flogging and killing their brothers. All who have devised, abated, decreed, executed, or allowed such crimes will make substantially the same reply. The authorities, those who have started, devised, and decreed the matter, will say that such acts are necessary for the maintenance of the existing order. The maintenance of the existing order is necessary for the welfare of the country and humanity, for the possibility of social existence and human progress. Men of poorer classes, peasants and soldiers, who will have to execute the deed of violence with their own hands, say that they do so because it is a command of their superior authority, and the superior authority knows what he is about. That those who are in authority ought to be in authority, and that they know what they are doing appears to them a truth, of which there can be no doubt. If they could admit the possibility of mistake or error, it would only be in functionaries of a lower grade. The highest authority, on which all the rest depends, seems to them immaculate beyond suspicion. Though expressing the motives of their conduct differently, both those in command and their subordinates are agreed in saying that they act thus because the existing order is the order with much and ought to exist at the present time, and that therefore to support it is a sacred duty of every man. On this acceptance of the necessity, and therefore immutability of the existing order, all who take part in acts of violence on the part of government base the argument always advanced in their justification. Since the existing order is immutable, they say, the refusal of a single individual to perform the duties laid upon him will effect no change in things, and will only mean that some other man will be put in his place who may do the same work, worse, that is to say, more cruelly, to the still greater injury of the victims of the act of violence. This conviction that the existing order is a necessary and therefore immutable order, which it is a sacred duty for every man to support, enables good men, of high principles in private life, to take part with conscience more or less untroubled in crimes such as that perpetuated in oral, and that which the men in Tolstoy were going to perpetuate. But what is this conviction based on? It is easy to understand that the landowner prefers to believe that the existing order is inevitable and immutable, because this existing order secures him an income from his hundreds and thousands of acres, by means of which he can lead his habitual indolent and luxurious life. It is easy to understand that the judge readily believes in the necessity of an order of things, through which he receives a wage 50 times as great as the most industrious laborer can earn. And the same applies to all the higher officials. It is only under the existing regime, that is governor, prosecutor, senator, members of the various councils, that they can receive their several thousands of rubles a year, about which they and their families would at once sink into ruin. Since it were not for the position they occupy, they would never by their own abilities, industry, or acquirements get a thousandth part of their salary. The minister, the czar, and the higher authorities are the same position. The only distinction is that the higher and the more exceptional their position, the more necessary it is for them to believe that the existing order is the only possible order of things. For without it, they would not only be unable to gain an equal position, but would be found to fall lower than all their people. A man who has of his own free will entered the police force at a wage of 10 rubles, which he could easily earn in any other position, is hardly dependent on the preservation of the existing regime, and so he may not believe in its immutability. But a king or an emperor who receives millions for his post, and knows that there are thousands of people around him who would like to dethrone him and take his place, who knows that he will never receive such a revenue or such honor in any other position, who knows in most cases, through his more or less despotic rule, that if he were dethroned he would have to answer for all his abuse of power. He cannot but believe in the necessity and even sacredness of the existing order. The higher and more profitable a man's position, the more unstable it becomes, and the more terrible and dangerous a fall from it for him, the more firmly the man believes in the existing order, and therefore with the more ease of conscience can such a man perpetuate cruel and wicked acts, as though they were not his own interests, but for the maintenance of that order. This is the case with all men in authority, who occupy positions more profitable than they could occupy except for the present regime. From the lowest police officer to the czar, all of them are more or less convinced that the existing order is immutable, because the chief consideration it is to their advantage. But the peasants, the soldiers, who are at the bottom of the social scale, who have no kind of advantage from the existing order, who are in the very lowest position of subjection and humiliation, what forces them to believe that the existing order in which they are in their humble and disadvantageous position is the order which ought to exist, and which they ought to support even at the cost of evil actions contrary to their conscience? What forces these men to the false reasoning that the existing order is unchanging, and that therefore they ought to support it, when it is so obvious, on the contrary, that it is only unchanging because they themselves support it? What forces these peasants, taken only yesterday from the plow and dressed in ugly and unseemly costumes with blue collars and gilt buttons, to go with guns and sabers and murder their famishing fathers and brothers? They gain no kind of advantage and can be in no fear of losing the position they occupy, because it is worse than that from which he had been taken. The persons in authority of the highest orders, landowners, merchants, judges, senators, governors, ministers, czars, and officers, take part in such doing because the existing order is to their advantage. In other respects, they are often good and kind-hearted men, and they are more able to take part in such doing because their share in them is limited to suggestion, decision, and orders. These persons and authorities never do themselves what they suggest, decide, or command to be done. For the most part, they do not even see how all the atrocious deeds they have suggested and authorized are carried out. But the unfortunate men of the lower orders, who gain no kind of advantage from the existing regime, but on the contrary are treated with the utmost contempt, support it even by dragging people with their own hands from their families, handcuffing them, throwing them in prison, guarding them, and shooting them. Why do they do it? What forces them to believe that the existing order is unchanging and they must support it? All violence rests, we know, on those who do the beating, the handcuffing, the imprisoning, and the killing with their own hands. If there were no soldiers or armed policemen ready to kill or outrage anyone as they are ordered, not one of those people who sign sentences of death, imprisonment, or galley slavery for life would make up his mind to hang, imprison, or torture 1,000th part of whom, quietly sitting in his study, he now orders to be tortured in all kinds of ways, simply because he does not see it nor do it himself, but only gets it done at a distance by those servile tools. All the acts of injustice and cruelty which are committed in the ordinary course of daily life have only become the habitual because they are these men always ready to carry out such acts of injustice and cruelty. If it were not for them, far from anyone using violence against the immense masses who are now ill-treated, those now who command their punishment would not venture to sentence them, would not even dare to dream of a sentence they decree with such easy confidence at present. And if it were not for these men, ready to kill or torture anyone at their commander's will, none would even dare to claim, as all the idle landowners claim with such assurance, that a piece of land surrounded by peasants, who are in wretchedness from want of land, is the property of a man who does not cultivate it, or that stores of corn taken by swindling from the peasants ought to remain untouched in the midst of population dying of hunger, because the merchants must make their profit. If it were not for these servile instruments at the disposal of the authority, it could never have entered the head of the landowner to rob the peasants of the forest they had tended, nor of the officials to think they are entitled to their salaries, taken from the famishing people, the price of their oppression. Least of all could anyone dream of killing or exiling men for exposing falsehood and telling the truth. All this can only be done because the authorities are confidently assured that they have always these servile tools at hand, ready to carry out all the demands in effect by means of torture and murder. All the deeds of violence of tyrants from Napoleon to the lowest commander of a company who fires upon a crowd can only be explained by the intoxicating effect of their absolute power over these slaves. All force, therefore, rests on these men, who carry out the deeds of violence with their own hands. The men who serve in the police or the army, especially the army, for the police only venture to do their work because the army is at their back. What, then, has brought these masses of honest men, on whom the whole thing depends, who gain nothing by it, and who have to do these atrocious deeds with their own hands? What has brought them to accept the amazing delusion that the existing order, unprofitable, ruinous, and fatal as it has been for them, is the order which ought to exist? Who has led them into this amazing delusion? They can never have persuaded themselves that they ought to do what is against their conscience, and also the source of misery and ruin for themselves and all their class, who make up 9/10 of the population. How can you kill people when it is written in God's commandment, "Thou shalt not kill"? I have often inquired of different soldiers, and I always drove them to embarrassment and confusion by reminding them of what they did not want to think about. They knew they were bound by the law of God, "Thou shalt not kill," and knew, too, that they were bound by their duty as soldiers, but had never reflected on the contradiction between these duties. The drift of the timid answers I received to these questions was always approximately this: that killing in war and executing criminals by command of the government are not included in the general prohibition of murder. But when I said this distinction was not made in the law of God, and reminded them of the Christian duty of fraternity, forgiveness of injuries, and love, which could not be reconciled with murder, the peasants usually agreed, but in their turn began to ask me questions. How does it happen, they inquired, that the government, which according to their ideas could not be wrong, sends the army to war and orders criminals to be executed? When I answered that the government does wrong in giving such orders, the peasants fell into still greater confusion, and either broke off the conversation or else got angry with me. They must have found a law for it. The archbishops know as much about it as we do, I should hope, a Russian soldier once observed to me. And in saying this, the soldier obviously set his mind at rest, in the full conviction that his spiritual guides had found a law which authorized his ancestors, and the czars and their descendants and millions of men to serve as he was doing himself, and that the question I had put him was a kind of hoax or conundrum on my part. Everyone in our Christian society knows, either by tradition or by revelation or by the voice of conscience, that murder is one of the most fearful crimes a man can commit, as the Gospel tells us, and that the sin of murder cannot be limited to certain persons. That is, murder cannot be a sin for some and not a sin for others. Everyone knows that if murder is a sin, it is always a sin. Whoever are the victims murder, just like the sin of adultery, theft, or any other. At the same time, from their childhood up, men see that murder is not only permitted, but even sanctioned by the blessing of those whom they are accustomed to regard as their divinely appointed spiritual guides, and see their secular leaders with calm assurance organizing murder, proud to wear murderous arms and demanding of others in the same of the laws of the country, and even of God, that they should take part in murder. Men see that there is some inconsistency here, but not being able to analyze it, involuntarily assume that this apparent inconsistency is only the result of their ignorance. The very grossness and obviousness of the inconsistency confirms them in this conviction. They cannot imagine that the leaders of civilization, the educated classes, could so confidently preach two such opposed principles as the law of Christ and murder. A simple, uncorrupted youth cannot imagine that those who stand so high in his opinion, whom he regards as holy or learned men, could for any object whatever mislead him so shamefully, but this is just what has always been and is always done to him. It is done by instilling, by example and direct instruction from childhood up, into the working place, who have no time to study moral and religious questions for themselves, the idea that torture and murder are compatible with Christianity, and that for certain objects of state, torture and murder are not only admissible, but ought to be employed. And by instilling into certain of the people who have either voluntarily enlisted or been taken by compulsion into the army, the idea that the perpetration of murder and torture with their own hands is a sacred duty, and even a glorious exploit, worthy of praise and reward. The general delusion is diffused among all people by means of the catechisms or books, which nowadays replace them in use for the compulsory education of children. In them it is stated that violence, that is, imprisonment and execution, as well as murder in civil or foreign wars, in the defense and maintenance of the existing state organization, whatever they may be, absolute or limited monarchy, convention, consulate, empire of this or that, Napoleon or Bollinger, constitutional monarchy, commune or republic, is absolutely lawful and not opposed to morally end Christianity. This is stated in all catechisms or books used in schools, and men are so thoroughly persuaded of it that they grow up, live and die in that conviction which once entertaining a doubt about it. This is one form of deception, the general deception instilled into everyone. But there is another special deception practiced upon the soldiers or police who are picked out by one means or another to do the torturing and murdering, necessary to defend and maintain the existing regime. In all military instruction there appears in one form or another what is expressed in the Russian military code in the following words. Article 87. To carry out exactly and without comment the orders of a superior officer means to carry out an order received from a superior officer exactly without considering whether it is good or not, and whether it is possible to carry it out. The superior officer is responsible for the consequence of the order he gives. Article 88. The subordinate ought never to refuse to carry out the orders of a superior officer, except when he sees clearly that in carrying out his superior officer's command he breaks the law of God. One involuntarily expects, not all, his oath of fidelity and allegiance to the Tsar. It is here said that the man who is a soldier can and ought to carry out all the orders of a superior without exception, and as these orders for the most part involve murder, it follows that he ought to break all the laws of God and man. The one law he may not break is that of fidelity and allegiance to the man who happens at the given moment to be in power. Precisely the same thing is said in other words in all codes of military instruction, and it could not be otherwise, since the whole power of the army and the state is based in reality on this delusion and emancipation of men from their duty to God and their conscience, and the substitution of duty to the superior officer for all other duties. This then is a foundation of the belief of the lower classes that the existing regime, so fatal for them, is the regime which ought to exist, and which they ought therefore to support even by torture and murder. This belief is founded on a conscious deception practiced on them by the higher classes, and it cannot be otherwise. To compel the lower classes, which are more numerous, to oppress and ill-treat themselves, even at the cost of actions opposed to their conscience, it was necessary to deceive them, and it has been done accordingly. Not many days ago I saw once more this shameless deception being openly practiced, and once more I marveled that it could be practiced so easily and impudently. At the beginning of November, as I was passing through Tula, I saw once again at the gates of the Zemsky courthouse the crowd of peasants I had so often seen before, and heard the drunken shouts of men mingled with the pitiful lamentations of their wives and mothers. It was the recruiting session. I can never pass by the spectacle. It attracts me by a kind of fascination of repulsion. I again went into the crowd, took my stand among the peasants, looked about and asked questions. And once again I was amazed that this hideous crime could be perpetrated so easily in broad daylight and in the midst of a large town. As is the custom in every year in all the villages and hamlets of the 100 millions of Russians, on the 1st of December, the village elders had assembled the young men inscribed on the list, often their own sons among them, and had brought them to the town. On the road the recruits had been drinking without intermission, unchecked by the elders, who feel at going on such an insane errand, abandoning their wives and mothers and renouncing all they hold sacred in order to become a senseless instrument of destruction, would be too agonizing if they were not stupefied with spirits. And so they come, drinking, swearing, singing, fighting, and scuffling with one another. They had spent the night in taverns. In the morning they had slept off their drunkenness and have gathered together at the Zemsky courthouse. Some of them in new sheepskin pelisses, with knitted scarves around their necks. Their eyes swollen from drinking, are shouting wildly to one another to show their courage. Others, crowded near the door, are quietly and mournfully waiting their turn, between their weeping and the mothers. I had chanced upon the day of actual enrolling, that is, the examination of those whose names were on the list. Others, meantime, were crowding into the hall of the recruiting office. Inside the office the work was going on rapidly. The door is open and the guards call Pyotr Sidorov. Pyotr Sidorov starts, crosses himself, and goes into a little room with a glass door where the conscripts undress. A comrade of Pyotr's who had just been passed for service and come naked out of the revision office is dressing hurriedly, his teeth chattering. Sidorov has already heard the news and can see in his face that he has been taken. He wants to ask him questions, but they hurry him and tell him to make haste and undress. He throws off his pelisse, slips off his boots of his feet, takes off his waistcoat and draws his shirt over his head, and naked, trembling all over, and exhaling an odor of tobacco, spirits, and sweat, goes into the revision office, not knowing what to do with his brawny bare arms. Directly facing him in the revision office hangs in a great gold frame a portrait of the Tsar in full uniform with decoration, and in the corner a little portrait of Christ in a shirt and a crown of thorns. In the middle of the room is a table covered with green cloth, of which there are papers lying and 3 cornet ornaments surrounded by an eagle, the zerzel. Round the table are sitting the revising officers, looking collected and indifferent. One is smoking a cigarette, another is looking through some papers. Directly Sidorov comes in, a guard goes up to him, places him under the measuring frame, raising him under his chin and strengthening his legs. The man with the cigarette, he is a doctor, comes up, and without looking at the recruit's face, but somewhat beyond it, feels his body over with an air of disgust, measures him, tests him, tells the guard to open his mouth, lets him to breathe, to speak. Someone notes something down. At last, without having once looked him in the face, the doctor said, "Right, next one," and with a weary air sits down again at the table. The soldiers again hustle and hurry the lad. He somehow gets into his trousers, wraps his feet in rags, puts on his boots, looks for the scarf and cap, and bundles his pelisses under his arm. Then they lead him into the main hall, shutting him off apart from the rest by a bench, behind which all the conscripts who have been passed for service are waiting. Another village lad like himself, but from a distant province, now a soldier armed with a gun, with a sharp-pointed bayonet at an end, keeps watch over him, ready to run him through the body if he should think of trying to escape. Meantime, the crowd of fathers, mothers, and wives, hustled by the police, are pressing around the door to hear whose lad has been taken, who is left off. One of the rejected comes out and announces that Pyotrov is taken, and at once a shrill cry is heard from Pyotrov's young wife, for whom this word, taken, means separation for 4 or 5 years. The life of a soldier's wife is a servant, often a prostitute. But here comes a man along the street with flowing hair and in a peculiar dress, who gets out of his drosky and goes into the Zemsky courthouse. The police clear a way for him through the crowd. It is the Reverend Father, come to administer the oath. And this father, who has been persuaded that he is specially and exclusively devoted to the service of Christ, and who, for the most part, does not himself see the deception in which he lives, goes into the hall where the conscripts are waiting. He throws around him a kind of curtain of brocade, pulls his long hair out over it, opens the very gospel in which swearing is forbidden, takes the cross, the very cross on which Christ was crucified, because he would do what this false servant of his is telling his men to do, and puts him on the lectern. And all these unhappy, defenseless, and deluded lads repeat after him the lie, which he utters with the assurance of familiarity. He reads, and they repeat after him, "I promise and swear by Almighty God upon this holy gospel, etc., to defend, etc., and that is, to murder anyone I am told to, and to do everything I am told by men I know nothing of, and who care nothing for me, except as an instrument for perpetuating the crimes by which they are kept in their position of power, and my brothers in their condition of misery." All the conscripts repeat these ferocious words without thinking, and then the so-called father goes away with a sense of having correctly and conscientiously done his duty. And all these poor deluded lads believe that these nonsensical and incomprehensible words which they have just uttered set them free for the whole time of their service from their duties of men, and lay upon them fresh and more binding duties as soldiers. And this crime is perpetuated publicly, and no one cries out to the deceiving and the deceived. Think what you are doing. This is the basest, falsest lie, by which not only bodies, but souls too are destroyed. No one does. On the contrary, when they have all been enrolled and they are all let out again, the military officer goes with a confident and majestic air into the hall where the drunken, cheated lads are shut up, and cries in a bold military voice, "To your health, my lads. I congratulate you on serving the Tsar." And they, the poor fellows, someone had given them a hint beforehand, mutter awkwardly, their voices thick with drink, something to the effect that they are glad. Meantime, the crowd of fathers, mothers, and wives is standing at the door waiting. The women kept their tearful eyes fixed on the doors. They open at last, and out come the conscripts, unsteady but trying to put a good face on it. Here are Pietrov and Vanna and Makar trying not to look their dear ones in the face. Nothing is heard but the wailing of the wives and mothers. Some of the lads embrace them and weep with them. Others make a show of courage, and others try to comfort them. The wives and mothers, knowing that they will be left for 3, 4, 5 years without their breadwinners, weep and rehearse their woes aloud. The fathers say little. They only utter a clucking sound with their tongues and sigh mournfully, knowing that they will see no more of the steady lads they have reared and trained to help them, that they will come back not the same quiet, hard-working laborers, but for the most part conceited and demoralized, unfitted for their simple life. And then all the crowd gets into their sledges again and move away down the street to the taverns and pothouses, and louder than ever the sounds of medley of singing and sobbing, drunken shouts and the wailing of the wives and mothers, the sounds of the accordion and oath. They all turn into the taverns, whose revenues go to the government, and the drinking bout begins, which stifles their sense of the wrong which is being done to them. For 2 or 3 weeks they go on living at home, and most of that time they are jaunting, that is, drinking. On a fixed day they collect them, drive them together like a flock of sheep, and begin to train them in the military exercise and drill. Their teachers are fellows like themselves, only deceived and brutalized 2 or 3 years sooner. The means of instruction are deception, stupefaction, blows, and vodka. And before a year has passed, these good, intelligent, healthy-minded lads will be as brutal being as their instructors. Come now, suppose your father was arrested and tried to make his escape, I asked a young soldier. I would run him through with my bayonet, he answered with a foolish intonation peculiar to soldiers, and if he made off, I ought to shoot him. He added, obviously proud of knowing what he must do if his father were escaping. And when a good-hearted lad has been brought to a state lower than that of a brute, he is just what is wanted by those to use him as an instrument of violence. He is ready. The man has been destroyed, and a new instrument of violence has been created. And all this is done every year, every autumn, everywhere, through all Russia in broad daylight in the midst of large towns, where all may see it. And the deception is so clever, so skillful, that though all men know the infamy out in their hearts and see all its horrible results, they cannot throw it off and be free. When one's eyes are open to this awful deception practiced upon us, one marvels at the teachers of the Christian religion, and of morals, the instructors of youth, or even the good-hearted and intelligent parents who are to be found in every society, can teach any kind of morality in a society in which it is openly admitted. It is so admitted, under all governments and all churches, that murder and torture form an indispensable element in the life of it, and that there must always be special men trained to kill their fellows, and that any one of us may have to become such a trained assassin. How can children, youth, and people generally be taught any kind of morality, not to speak of teaching in the spirit of Christianity, side by side with the doctrine that murder is necessary for the public weal and therefore legitimate, and that these are men, of whom each of us may have to be one, whose duty is to murder and torture and commit all sorts of crimes at the will of those who are in possession of authority? If this is so, and one can and ought to murder and torture, there is not and cannot be any kind of moral law, but only the law that might is right. And this is just how it is. In reality, that is the doctrine, justified to some by the theory of the struggle of existence, which reigns in our society. And indeed, what sort of ethical doctrine could admit the legitimacy of murder for any object whatever? It is impossible as a theory of mathematics admitting that 2 is equal to 3. There may be a semblance of mathematics admitting that 2 is equal to 3, but there can be no real science of mathematics. And there can only be a semblance of ethics in which murder is a shape of war and execution of criminals is allowed, but no true ethics. The recognition of the life of every man is sacred as the first and only basis of all ethics. The doctrine of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth has been abrogated by Christianity, because it is the justification of immorality and a mere semblance of equality, and has no real meaning. Life is a value which has no weight, no size, and cannot be compared to any other, and so there is no sense in destroying a life for a life. Besides, every social law aims at the amelioration of man's life. What way, then, can the annihilation of the life of some man ameliorate men's life? Annihilation of life cannot be the means of the amelioration of life. It is a suicidal act. To destroy another life for the sake of justice is as though a man, to repair the misfortune of losing one's arm, should cut off the other arm for the sake of equity. But putting aside the sin of deluding men into regarding the most awful crime as a duty, putting aside the revolting sin of using the name and authority of Christ to sanction what he most condemned, not to speak of the curse of those who cause these little ones to offend, how can people who cherish their own way of life, their progress, even from the point of view of their personal security, allow the formation in their midst of an overwhelming force of senseless, cruel, and destructive as every government is organized on the basis of an army? Even the most cruel band of brigands is not so much to be dreaded as such a government. The power of every brigand chief is at least so far limited that the men of his band preserve at least some human liberty, and can refuse to commit acts opposed to their conscience. But owing to the perfection to which the discipline of the army has been brought, there is no limit to check men who form part of a regularly organized government. There are no crimes so revolting that would not readily be committed by men who form part of a government or army, or at the will of anyone, such as Bollinger, Napoleon, or Puchif, who may chance to be at their head. Often when one sees conscription levies, military drills and maneuvers, police officers with loaded revolvers, and sentinels at their posts with bayonets at their rifles, when one hears for whole days at a time, as I hear it in the Hamavati where I live, the whistles of balls and a dull thud as they fall on the sand, when one sees in the midst of a town where any effort at violence and self-defense is forbidden, where the sale of powder and of chemicals, where furious driving and practicing as a doctor without a diploma and so on are not allowed, thousands of disciplined troops, trained to murder, and subject to one man's will, one asks oneself, how can people who prize their security quietly allow it and put up with it? Apart from the immorality and evil effects of it, nothing can possibly be more unsafe. What are people thinking about? I don't mean now Christians, ministers of religion, philanthropists and moralists, but simply people who value their life, their security, and their comfort. This organization, we know, will work just as well in one man's hand as in others. Today, let us assume, power is in the hands of a ruler who can be endured, but tomorrow it may be seized by a Brion, an Elizabeth, a Catherine, a Napoleon, or a Napoleon III. And the man in authority, endurable today, may become a brute tomorrow, or may be succeeded by a mad or imbecile hare, like the King of Bavaria or our Paul I. And not only the highest authorities, but all little satraps scattered out everywhere, like so many General Baronovs, governors, police officers even, and commanders of companies, can perpetrate the most awful crimes before there is time for them to be removed from office. And this is what is constantly happening. One involuntarily asks, how can men let it go on, not from higher consideration only, but from regard to their own safety? To answer this question is that it is not all people who do tolerate. Some, the greater proportion, deluded and submissive, have no choice and have to tolerate anything. It is tolerated by those who only under such an organization can occupy a position of profit. They tolerate it because for them the risks of suffering from a foolish or cruel man, being at the head of the government or the army, are always less than the disadvantages to which they would be exposed by the destruction of the organization itself. A judge, a commander of police, a governor, or any officer will keep his position just the same under Bollinger or the Republic, under Pouchet or Catherine. He will lose his profitable position for certain if the existing order of things which secured it to him is destroyed. And so all these people feel no uneasiness as to who is at the head of the organization. They will adapt themselves to anyone. They only dread the downfall of the organization of itself, and that is the reason, though often an unconscious one, that they support it. One often wonders why independent people, who are not forced to do so in any way, the so-called elite of society, should go into the army in Russia, England, Germany, Austria, and even France, and seek opportunities of becoming murderers. Why do even high-principled parents send their boys to military school? Why do mothers buy their children toy helmets, guns, and swords as playthings? The peasants' children never play at soldiers, by the way. Why do good men and even women, who have certainly no interest in war, go into raptures over the various exploits of Skoplev and others, and vie with one another and glorify them? Why do men, who are not obligated to do so and get no fee for it, devote, like the marshals of nobility in Russia, whole months of toil to a business physically disagreeable and morally painfully the enrolling of conscripts? Why do all kings and emperors wear the military uniform? Why do they all hold military reviews? Why do they organize maneuvers, distribute rewards to the military, and raise monuments to generals and successful commanders? Why do rich men of independent position consider it an honor to perform a valet's duties in attendance on crown personage, flattering them and cringing to them and pretending to believe in their peculiar superiority? Why do men who have ceased to believe in the superstitions of the medieval church, and who could not possibly believe in them seriously and consistently, pretend to believe in and give their support to the demoralizing and blasphemous institution of the church? Why is it that not only governments but private persons of the higher classes try so jealously to maintain the ignorance of the people? Why do they fall with such fury on any effort at breaking down religious superstitions or really enlightening the people? Why do historians, novelists, and poets, who have no hope of gaining anything by their flatteries, make heroes of kings, emperors, and conquerors of past time? Why do men who call themselves learned dedicate whole lifetimes to making theories to prove that violence employed by authority against the people is not violence at all, but a special right? One often wonders why a fashionable lady and artist who, one would think, would take no interest in political or military questions, should always condemn strikes of working people and defend war, and should always be found without hesitation opposed to the other, favorable to the other. But one no longer wonders when one realizes that in the higher classes there is an unerring instinct of what tends to maintain and what tends to destroy the organization by virtue of which they enjoy their privilege. The fashionable lady had certainly not reasoned out that if there were no capitalists, no army to defend them, her husband would have no fortune, and she could not have her entertainment and her ball dresses. And the artist certainly does not argue that he needs the capitalists and the troops to defend them, so that he may buy his picture. But instinct, replacing reason in this instance, guides him unerringly. And it is precisely this instinct which leads all men, with few exceptions, to support all the religious, political, and economic institutions which are to their advantage. But it is possible that the higher classes should support the existing order of things simply because it is to their advantage? Cannot they see that this order of things is essentially irrational, that it is no longer consistent with the stage of moral development attained by people, and with public opinion, and that it is fraught with perils? The governing classes, or at least the good, honest, and intelligent people of them, cannot but suffer from these fundamental inconsistencies, and see the dangers with which they are threatened. And it is possible that all the millions of the lower classes can feel easy in conscience when they commit such obviously evil deeds as torture and murder from fear of punishment. Indeed, it could not be so. Neither the former nor the latter could fail to see the irrationality of their conduct, if the complexity of governmental organizations did not obscure the unnatural senselessness of their actions. So many instigate, assist, or sanction the commission of every one of these actions, that no one who was in the hand of them feels himself morally responsible for it. It is the custom among assassins to oblige all the witnesses of a murder to strike the murdered victim, that the responsibility may be divided among a large number of people as possible. The same principle in different forms is applied under the government organization in the perpetuation of the crimes, without which no government organization could exist. Rulers always try to implicate as many citizens as possible in all the crimes committed in their support. Of late, this tendency has been expressed in a very obvious manner by the obligation of all citizens to take part in legal processes as jurors, in the army as soldiers, in the local government or legislative assembly as electors or members. Just as in a wicker basket, all the ends are so hidden away that it is hard to find them, in the state organization the responsibility for the crimes committed is so hidden away that men will commit the most atrocious acts without seeing their responsibility for them. In ancient times, tyrants got credit for the crimes they committed, but in our day, the most atrocious infamies, inconceivable under the Neros, are perpetuated and no one gets blamed for them. One set of people have suggested, another set have proposed, a third have reported, a fourth have decided, a fifth has confirmed, a sixth have given the order, and the seventh set of men have carried it out. They hang, they flog to death women, old men, and innocent people, as was done recently among us in Russia at the Yaksha factory, and has always been done everywhere in Europe and America, in the struggle with the anarchists and all other rebels against the existing order. They shoot and hang men by hundreds and thousands, or massacre millions in war, or break men's hearts in solitary confinement, and ruin their souls in the corruption of a soldier's life, and no one is responsible. At the bottom of the social scale, soldiers, armed with guns, pistols, and sabers, injure and murder people, and compel men through these means to enter the army, and are absolutely convinced that the responsibility for the actions rests solely on the officers who command them. At the top of the scale, the czars, the presidents, ministers, and parliaments decree these tortures and murders and military conscription, and are fully convinced that since they are either placed in authority by the grace of God or by the society they govern, which demands such decrees from them, they cannot be held responsible. Between these two extremes are the intermediate personages who superintend the murders and other acts of violence, and are fully convinced that the responsibility is taken off their soldiers partly by their superiors who have given the order, partly by the fact that such orders are expected from them by all who are at the bottom of the scale. The authority who gives the orders and the authority who executes them at the two extreme ends of the state organization meet together like the two ends of a ring. They support and rest on one another and enclose all that lies within the ring. Without the conviction that there is a person or persons who will take the whole responsibility of the act, not one soldier would ever lift a hand to commit a murder or other deed of violence. Without the conviction that it is expected by the whole people, not a single king, emperor, president, or parliament would order murders or acts of violence. Without the conviction that there are persons of a higher grade who will take the responsibility, and people of a lower grade who require such acts for their welfare, not one of the intermediate class would superintend such deeds. The state is so organized that wherever a man is placed in the social scale, his irresponsibility is the same. The higher his grade, the more he is under the influence of demands from above, and the less he is controlled by orders from above, and vice versa. All men, then, bound together by state organization, throw the responsibility of their acts on one another. The peasant soldier of the nobleman or merchant who is the officer, and the officer of the nobleman who has been appointed governor. The governor on the nobleman or son of an official who is minister. The minister on the member of the royal family who occupies the post of czar, and the czar again on all these officials, noblemen, merchant, and peasants. But that is not all. Besides the fact that men get rid of the sense of responsibility for their actions in this way, they lose their moral sense of responsibility also by the fact that in forming themselves into a state organization, they persuade themselves and each other so continually and so indefatigability that they are not all equal, but as stars apart, that they come to believe it genuinely themselves. Thus some are persuaded that they are not simple people like everyone else, but special people who are to be specially honored. It is instilled into another set of men by every possible means that they are inferior to others, and therefore must submit without a murmur to every order given them by their superiors. On this inequality above all, on the elevation of some and the degradation of others, rests the capacity men have of being blind to the insanity of the existing order of life, and all the cruelty and criminality of the deception practiced by one set of men on another. Those in whom the idea has been instilled, that they are invested with a special supernatural grandeur and consequence, are so intoxicated with a sense of their own imaginary dignity that they cease to feel a responsibility for what they do, while those, on the other hand, in whom the idea is fostered that they are inferior animals, bound to obey their superiors in everything, fall through this perpetual humiliation into a strange condition of stupefied servility, and in this stupefied state do not see the significance of their actions and lose all consciousness of responsibility for what they do. The intermediary class, who obey the orders of their superiors on the one hand and regard themselves as superior beings on the other, are intoxicated by power and stupefied by servility at the same time, and so lose a sense of their responsibility. One need only glance during a review at the commander-in-chief, intoxicated with self-importance, followed by his retinue, all on magnificent and gaily apparelled horses, in splendid uniforms and wearing decorations, and see how they ride to the harmonious and solemn strains of music before the ranks of soldiers, all presenting arms and petrified with servility. One need only glance at this spectacle to understand that at such moments, when they are in a state of the most complete intoxication, commander-in-chief, soldiers and intermediate officers alike would be capable of committing crimes on which they would never dream under any other conditions. The intoxication produced by such stimulus as parades, reviews, religious solemnities, and coronations is, however, an acute and temporary condition. But there are other forms of chronic, permanent intoxication in which these are liable who have any kind of authority, from that of the czar to that of the lowest police officer on a street corner, and also those who are subjected to authority and in a state of stupefied servility. The latter, like all slaves, always find a justification for their own servility in ascribing the greatest possible dignity and importance to those they serve. It is principally through this false idea of inequality and the intoxication of power and servility resulting from it that men associated in a state organization are enabled to commit acts opposed to their conscience without the least scruple or remorse. Under the influence of this intoxication, men imagine themselves no longer simply men as they are, but some special beings, noblemen, merchants, governors, judges, officers, czars, ministers, or soldiers, no longer bound by ordinary human duties, but by other duties far more weighty, the peculiar duties of a nobleman, merchant, governor, czar, or soldier. Thus the landowner, who claimed the forest, acted as he did only because he fancied himself not a simple man, having the same rights to life as the persons living beside him and everywhere else, but a great landowner, a member of the nobility, and under the influence of the intoxication of power he felt his dignity offended by the peasant's claim. It was only through this feeling that, without considering the consequence that might follow, he sent in a claim to be reinstated in his pretended rights. In the same way the judges who wrongfully adjudicated the judge and the forest to the proprietor did so simply because they fancied themselves not simply men like everyone else, and so bound to be guided in everything only by what they consider right, but under the intoxicating influence of power imagine themselves the representatives of the justice which cannot err, while under the intoxicating influence of servility they imagine themselves bound to carry out the letter of the instruction inscribed in a certain book, the so-called law. In the same way, all who take part in such an affair, from the highest representative authority, on whose signs he has assent to the report, from the superintendent presiding at the recruiting session, and the priest who deludes the recruits, to the lowest soldier who is ready now to fire on his own brothers, imagine, in the intoxication of power or of servility, that they are some conventional characters. They do not face the question that is presented to them whether or not they ought to take part in what their conscience judges are evil acts, but fancy themselves various conventional personages. One is a czar, God's anointed, an exceptional being, called to watch over the happiness of over 100 million men. Another is a representative of nobility. Another is a priest who has received special grace by his ordination. Another is a soldier, bound by his military oath to carry out all he is commanded without reflection. Only under the intoxication of the power or the servility of their imagined positions could all these people act as they do. Were not they all firmly convinced that their respective vocations of czar, minister, governor, judge, nobleman, landowner, superintendent, officer, and soldiers are something real and important, not one of them would even think without horror and aversion of taking part in what they do now. The conventional positions established hundreds of years, recognized for centuries and by everyone, distinguished by special names and dresses, and moreover confirmed by every kind of solemnity, have so penetrated into men's minds through their senses, that forgetting the ordinary conditions of life common to all, they look at themselves and everyone only from this conventional point of view, and are guided in their estimation of their own actions and those of others by this conventional standard. Thus we see a man of perfect sanity and ripe age, simply because he is decked out with some fringe, or embroidered keys on his coat, or colored ribbon only fit for some gaily dressed girl, and is told that he is a general, a chamberlain, a knight of the order of St. Andrew, or some similar nonsense, suddenly become self-important, proud, and even happy, or on the contrary, grow melancholy and unhappy to the point of falling ill, because he has failed to obtain the expected decoration or title. Or what is still more striking, a young man, perfectly sane in every other matter, independent and beyond the fear of want, simply because he has been appointed judicial prosecution or district commander, separates a poor widow from her little children, and shuts her up in prison, leaving her children uncared for, all because the unhappy woman carried on a secret trade in spirits, and so deprived the revenue of 25 rubles, and he does not feel the least pang of remorse. Or what is still more amazing, a man otherwise sensible and good-hearted, simply because he is given a badge or a uniform to wear, and told that he is a guard or customs officer, is ready to fire on people, and neither he nor those around him regard him as to blame for it, but on the contrary, would regard him as to blame if he did not fire. To say nothing of judges and juries, who condemn men to death, and soldiers who kill men by thousands without the slightest scruple merely because it has been instilled into them that they are not simply men, but jurors, judges, generals, and soldiers. This strange and abnormal condition of men under state organization is usually expressed in the following words: "As a man, I pity him. but as a guard, judge, general, governor, czar, or soldier, it is my duty to kill or torture him. Just as though there were some positions conferred and recognized which would exonerate us from the obligations laid on each of us by the fact of our common humanity. So, for example, in the case before us, men going to murder and torture the famishing, and they admit that in a dispute between the peasants and the landowners, the peasants are right. All those in command said as much to me. They know that the peasants are wretched, poor and hungry, and the landowner is rich and inspires no sympathy. Yet they are all going to kill the peasants to secure 3,000 rubles for the landowner, only because in that moment they fancy themselves not men but governor, official general of police, officer and soldier respectively, and consider themselves bound to obey, not the eternal demands of the conscience of man, but the casual, temporary demands of their positions as officer and soldiers. Strange as it may seem, the sole explanation of this astonishing phenomena is that they are in the condition of the hypnotized, who, they say, feel and act like the creatures they are commanded by the hypnotizers to represent. When, for instance, it is suggested to the hypnotized subject that he is lame, he begins to walk lame, that he is blind and he cannot see, that he is a wild beast and he begins to bite. That is the state, not only for those who are going on this expedition, but of all men who fulfill their state and social duties in preference to and in determent to their human duties. The essence of this state is that under the influence of one suggestion they lose the power of criticizing their action and therefore do without thinking, everything consistent with the suggestion, to which they are led by example, precept, or insinuation. The difference between those hypnotized by scientific men and those under the influence of the state hypnotism is that an imaginary position is suggested to the former suddenly by one person in a very brief space of time. And so the hypnotized state appears to us in a striking and surprising form, while the imaginary position suggested by state influence is induced slowly, little by little, imperceptibly from childhood, sometimes during years or even generations, and not in one person alone but in the whole society. But it will be said, at all times in all societies, the majority of persons, all the children, all the women absorbed in the bearing and rearing of the young, all the great mass of the laboring population who are under the necessity of incessant and fatiguing physical labor, all those of weak character by nature, all those who are abnormally enfeebled intellectually by the effects of nicotine, alcohol, opium, or other intoxicants, are always in a condition of incapacity for independent thought, and are either in subjection to those who are on the higher intellectual level, or else under the influence of family or social traditions, of what is called public opinion, and there is nothing unnatural or incongruous in their subjection. And truly there is nothing unnatural in it, and the tendency of men of small intellectual power to follow the leads on a higher level of intellectual intelligence is a constant law, and it is owing to that men can live in societies and on the same principles at all. The minority consciously adopt certain rational principles through their correspondence with reason, while the majority act the same principles unconsciously because it is required by public opinion. Such subjection to public opinion on the part of the unintellectual does not assume an unnatural character till the public opinion is split in two. But there are times when a higher truth, revealed at first to a few perpmen, gradually gains ground till it has taken hold of such a number of persons that the old public opinion, founded on a lower order of things, begins to totter, and the new is ready to take its place, but has not yet been firmly established. It is like the spring, this time of transition, when the old order of ideas has not quite broken up, and the new has not quite gained a footing. Men begin to criticize their action in the light of a new truth, but in the meantime, in practice, through inertia and tradition, they continue to follow the principles which once represented the highest point of rational consciousness, but are now in flagrant contradiction with it. Then men are in abnormal wavering condition, feeling the necessity of following a new ideal, and yet not bold enough to break with the old established traditions. Such is the attitude in regard to the truth of Christianity, not only of the men in the Tula train, but of the majority of men of our times, alike of the higher and lower orders. Those of the ruling classes have no longer any reasonable justification for the profitable positions they occupy, are forced, in order to keep them, to stifle their highest rational faculty of loving, and to persuade themselves that their positions are indispensable. And those of the lower classes, exhausted by toil and brutalized on set purposes, are kept in a permanent deception, practiced deliberately and continuously by the higher classes upon them. Only in this way can one explain the amazing contradictions which our life is full, and of which a striking example was presented to me by the expedition I met on the 9th of September. Good, peaceful men, known to me personally, going with untroubled tranquility to perpetuate the most beastly, senseless, and vile of crimes. Had not they some means of stifling their conscience, not one of them would be capable of committing 100th part of such a villainy. It is not that they have not a conscience which forbids them from acting thus, just as, even 300 or 400 years ago, when people burnt men at the stake, and put them to the rack, they had a conscience which prohibited it. The conscience is there, but it has been put to sleep, in those in command by what the psychologists call autosuggestion. In the soldiers,